Buffs come at us left and right in the ever-changing generational shifts of competitive Pokemon. But some of them are more than, say, the slight base stat boost afforded to Pokemon like Pelipper. Yeah, definitely the only sort of buff that Pokemon ever received. Indeed, no matter how you slice it, you're going to be leaving a lot of things out of a list like this, even when you go through the entire alphabet all the way to Z. But what's great is that means such a list will always remain interesting anyway. So let's jump right into it. Join us in counting down the 10 most game-changing buffs to Pokemon of all time. For the first 7 generations, Teleport was that move that made Abra annoyingly difficult to catch, or that move you might use to get yourself back to a Pokemon Center before you receive Fly. Competitively, it did literally nothing. It was Splash with less PP. In Generation 8, however, technically Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, but carried over to the mainline series for the first time in Sword and Shield, Teleport went from doing literally nothing to, well, almost everything. We've talked many times on this channel about the power of switch moves, and especially about the unique power of slow switch moves, which allow the incoming Pokemon to switch in safely. It's why you'd occasionally see things like Rotom Wash with its speed IVs lowered to get the second Volt switch off in the mirror. However, this of course was opponent dependent and could be blocked by ground types or Volt absorbers, while U-Turn had the issue of being punished by contact items like Rocky Helmet and abilities like Rough Skin, Iron Barbs, or even Static and Flame Body. Teleport was buffed to not just become a non-damaging pure switch move, much how boostless Baton Pass is used. Yes, it can be blocked by Taunt, but it also can't be punished for its uses like those other moves can be. If your Teleport goes off, you're not going to get chipped or status for your trouble. Plus, active use of Taunt is much easier to get around than having to Volt switch around the ground types that are on basically every competitive team. However, the real kicker is Teleport's negative priority. This means you get that slower switch no matter what you're using it on. All you need is a Pokemon bulky enough to tank hits. Teleport got its start with Clefable, whose effortless walling of half the metagame, if not more, alongside with Wish, meant it wasn't just getting teammates in for free to whatever end they desired. It was getting its teammates in and healing them. There was a period of Gen 8 OU completely dominated by Wishport Clefable. It was not impossible to stop it from doing things. This only ceased once the more well-known teleporters showed up, the Slow Twins. Well-known is putting it mildly. They completely defined Gen 8 OU through how unstoppable they were at using the move. Assisted by the hazard immunity of heavy-duty boots and their regenerator ability, they had an even easier time than Magic Guard Clefable at staying healthy, especially with the one-turn heal of Slack Off when necessary, and while they don't pass health to their teammates, they get them in with such absurd ease that it almost didn't matter, especially because they weren't just taking hits and getting their teammates in, but they were also setting up ferocious offense with Future Sight, which paired beautifully with Teleport and their hard-hitting teammates. There were genuinely talks of Future Sight being too strong for how unwallable it was in many respects. What answers were there to the Slow Twins' Future Port antics? You'd often be asking that question into a mirror, as you were probably using the strategy yourself. Now, as far as the Slow Twins were concerned, Teleport hardly needed the negative priority since they are already outrun by everything and their mother anyway. Though yes, it was nice to get the slow switch off against paralyzed Pokemon as well. However, the Slow Twins began using a speed lowering nature and 0 speed IVs so they could be as slow as possible. But when they were both doing that, it resulted in a speed tie anyway, one of the most ridiculous ones imaginable, where both players with their slowed out Pokemon hoped to lose the tie so they could move second. A small handful of players even used level 99 Slow Twins just to ensure they moved second. Now that was ridiculous. Though to our knowledge, there was never a major tournament game where 2 level 99 Slow Twins faced off and speed tied. Generation 9 has continued the tradition with chilly reception, but Teleport kicked off a new era of switch move abuse and launched its already excellent users to mega stardom. In Generation 4, Gastrodon, while certainly capable of a niche in OU, was instead seen as a sub-Swampert and even sub-Quagsire wall, hence it landing all the way down in NU. Swampert was the OU standard for Stealth Rock, Roar, and potential for punishing offense, while Quagsire had a serious niche in the tier as well for its access to recover and water absorb, giving it a water immunity so useful it was even used to great success in Ubers, where it took on none other than King Kyogre. Gastrodon was stuck with Sticky Hold, making it immune to the item removal of Trick and Knockoff. Not a bad niche by any means, but it paled in comparison to its competition. Oh sure, it had Storm Drain, but the ability had no use in singles back then. It only worked in doubles, drawing in all water moves much like Lightning Rod did electric moves. And seeing as Gastrodon was neutral to these water moves, it wasn't exactly the wisest strategy in doubles either. In Generation 5 though, Storm Drain was buffed to provide a complete water immunity. This was enormous in the same generation as Drizzle making its OU debut, and Gastrodon skyrocketed to become a top-tier fixture of standard play for its ability to devour even the strongest Rainy Specs Hydro Pump. With its superior bulk, it completely out-Quagsired Quagsire, or at least what Quagsire had been previously, as Gen 5 had also given Quagsire new purpose in Unaware, which was itself a boost so huge it almost made this list. Regardless, it was Gastrodon now seeing Kyogre stopping use in Ubers as well, while becoming OU proper, blending its typing's innate excellence of being a water type immune to electric, as well as being a ground type neutral to ice, with water immunity. As a bonus, if it was actually hit by a water move, it would gain a special attack boost, and hit deceptively hard. In Black and White 1, it was even somewhat common for top players to use choice specs, and especially Life Orb Gastrodon, which were incredibly difficult to answer. Give it that special attack boost, and watch as your Ferrothorn gets rocked by Earth Power, or even just Surf if the rain is up. Gastrodon continued its crucial defensive presence in the generations to follow. It was also Quagsire-esque in how it defined the tiering rung. It was actually NU in Gen 6 and 8, and PU in Gen 7, but it always had an important defensive presence in OU. It wasn't even like it was particularly rare or a good player's secret or anything. It was quite common in important games. There was even a team tournament final in Gen 7 where, in both OU matches, both players used Gastrodon despite its PU status at the time. Seeing 4 Gastrodon at the highest stage at the most must-win time is a testament to how important it was, and that was largely because of how important a water immunity always is. At that particular time, it was prized for its ability to completely stuff Ash Greninja. Storm Drain Gastrodon also has excellent utility in VGC, of course. Now that it's immune to water, you can reap the full benefit of redirecting all of those water moves at it. This is largely a singles-focused video, but we had to mention this monstrosity, and the reason Wolf Glick lives in terror. While we wish him peace, we also wish to counter practically everything with one Pokemon, and that doesn't really stretch the truth of the Incineroar effect too much, for how outrageously ubiquitous it is. It makes the catch all of its predecessor Landorus Therian look like a decent niche pick. Incineroar was an okay Pokemon when it had just its Blaze ability, as all other fire starters do. It's got good stats, good typing, both defensively and offensively, good move pool, but with Intimidate, its switch-in potential skyrockets, really making the most of its already good bulk, and not just for defensive purposes either. Greater innate defensive utility makes it easier to get offensive use out of it too, like when it unleashes its signature Insinium Z in Generation 7. Most of the time though, Incineroar is plunging into the never-ending depths of its seismically impactful support move pool. It's got the Peerless doubles move that is Fake Out, which would already be enormous, but it just keeps going. Stab, Knockoff, and Snarl, Will-O-Wisp, Taunt, U-Turn, Roar, and in Gen 8 it received Parting Shot, just to reinforce the idea that nothing was going to break it, or its teammates for that matter, especially since Parting Shot switching it out meant it got to switch back in and Intimidate again, rinse and repeat. Alternatively, you can go with Assault Vest to make sure you're tanking hits on both sides of the spectrum right off the bat, while still providing an ocean of utility through Fake Out, Knockoff, and U-Turn, with U-Turn also allowing you to cycle Intimidates beautifully. There's basically nothing Incineroar can't take on. It's taken on the likes of Zacian Crown. It also has a generally ridiculous list of strong moves it can withstand, like Mean Xiao's Close Combat, and with Assault Vest, Specs Miraidon's Electro Drift. Seeing as VGC games go quickly, being able to defend against the highest currency of such battles, moves that have a habit of one-hit KOing targets, makes an Incineroar user immeasurably rich, though the effect is somewhat balanced by the fact that almost everyone is an Incineroar user. Of course, that means winners tend to be Incineroar users. Economic parallels aside, Incineroar has become the VGC Pokemon for generations now, an achievement so impressive, it wormed its way in here to a list otherwise completely devoted to singles. Cloyster was a good Pokemon in the first 4 generations. It was great in Gen 1, outright elite in Gen 2, pretty decent in Gen 3, and it had a small niche in Gen 4, though it was mostly relegated to UU, where it was quite good. It also had a small niche in Ubers. However, Cloyster always succeeded in spite of the flaws forced upon it by its crippling half-ice typing. A pure water Cloyster would be a monstrously difficult Pokemon to KO, as it wouldn't constantly be having its amazing defense undercut by weaknesses to common physical moves in rock and fighting, especially once Stealth Rock joined the fray. It doesn't make for a very reliable support Pokemon. Then came Gen 5, and Cloyster dispensed with support in favor of one of the most shattering offenses in the game by virtue of gaining Shell Smash, which doubles both of your attacking stats, doubles speed, and Cloyster got the mega powerful Ice Stab that was Skill Link Icicle Spear, which made it a metagame destroyer, and many times at that. At first it was used as pure cheese, with Icicle Spear's 5 hits pairing with King's Rock to provide a high rate flinch move like a Jirachi that 2-hit KO'd almost everything because it was incredibly strong and had arguably the most spammable stab type in the game. It sliced through Magic Guard Alakazam's Focus Sash thanks to its multi-hit nature, and even if you had a check like Keldeo, it would just flinch you, or crit you for that matter, which the 5 hits also tended to produce a lot of. And even though it was just an individual hit getting the crit, not all 5, this still pushed it way over the edge since it was coming from a boosted stat, and it just needed the crit or the flinch. You couldn't outspeed it either. Even Scarf Latios fell to boosted Ice Shard, so you mostly wound up having to pray. This resulted in King's Rock being banned, but Cloyster wasn't done. It was discovered that the gems powered up every hit of a multi-hit move, like Breloom's Bullet Seed or ding ding ding, Cloyster's Icicle Spear. Suddenly it didn't need luck. It was probably just dropping you with raw power, and once that first target fell, say goodbye to the rest. Alternatively, you could rely on Rotom Wash or Heatran, which took even gem boosted Icicle Spears, but then Cloyster busted out the Rock Gem boosted Rock Blast, and those dropped like, well, a rock. Cloyster was, alongside its common teammate Volcarona, one of the most broken examples of gem abuse that eventually led to the ban of gems as a whole, but it still wasn't done. It began running mixed sets with Hidden Power Grass and Hydro Pump, since after all, Shell Smash doubled its special attack as well. With HP Grass, say goodbye to your Keldeo and Slowbro, while Hydro Pump ensured it was dropping Magnezone and Heatran too. Countering Cloyster wound up just being ridiculous. You couldn't do it through bulk or outspeeding it, or even resist, because in addition to outrunning everything, it was also throttling everything through variety on top of the sheer power that already tended to get the job done on its own. Cloyster was eventually banned from Gen 5 OU, and it didn't even end there. Cloyster also saw occasional use in further generations of OU thanks to the power of Shell Smash, a game ender like almost nothing else, and even beyond that, it also saw repeated use in Ubers. No, it wasn't sweeping teams there, rather it used the immense threat of Shell Smash Icicle Spear into enabling itself as an outstanding spikes lead that you wouldn't be able to defog or spin against. Its power also meant you wouldn't be able to reliably spin block it, meaning it'd be able to keep the field clear of opposing hazards for the time being, making it an excellent starting support for fast-paced teams. And of course, Icicle Spear's multiple hits meant it sliced through Focus Sashes like those of Rayquaza or Excadrill. It was at its very best, of course, in Gen 5, and Shell Smash launched Cloyster into the stratosphere. It went from suffering the worst indignities of the Ice type to brandishing its broken best. Despite their great stats, typing, the Slow Twins' defensive potential was always marred by them being, well, slow. And though tanky, they were far from immortal, meaning they couldn't shrug off hits forever. Receiving the instant recovery of Slack Off in Gen 4 certainly helped, but even still, they were quite exploitable for how often they were forced into using Slack Off. Their bulk would be impressive at first, but would tend to collapse under the sustained pressure of a prolonged assault. Tangrowth was similarly flawed. Its HP and defense were titanic, but it couldn't consistently keep itself healthy enough, largely thanks to how easily its non-existent speed was exploited. Then Gen 5 came around. The Dream World gifted this trio the hidden ability of Regenerator, and they took off as some of the best hit takers in the game. They went from not being able to shrug off hits forever to, well, shrugging off hits forever. No longer did they need to manually heal at every turn. Nope, now they took your hit and actively threatened you in return. Since they knew when they switched out, they'd gain enough health to switch into you again. Indeed, it made breaking through them quite the challenge. Starting in Gen 5, the power creep was so enormous that many traditional defensive answers to big threats would get overwhelmed by the barrage of threats effortlessly, but these Pokemon were crucial in providing stability and tangibly useful, consistent bulk to a metagame where the thought of playing defensively was increasingly becoming seen as unreliable. Then in Black and White 2, the power creep had the ante upped once again, but Amoonguss joined the fray, having just gained the previously unreleased Regenerator itself, and just as Slowbro and Tangrowth had held off monsters like Excadrill, Garchomp, and Terrakion. Now Amoonguss helped enormously against Keldeo, Technician Breloom, and to an extent, even the practically uncounterable Thundurus Therian. Keldeo was so strong, eventually Slowbro started seeing serious OU play as well, as its specially bulky Slowbro style talent came in immensely handy there. Regenerator pairings would become quite common as well, usually Slowbro and Amoonguss, though Slowking and Tangrowth also saw some major success. Having one Pokemon that reinforced its longevity was excellent enough given how much it was covering, but having two, especially when these Pokemon often switched in on each other's responses, it made for some of the most consistent defense available. Gen 5 was a starting point for all these Pokemon, and it should be mentioned that they were tremendous in that gen's lower tiers as well, but Regenerator imbued them with such life as to continue to become essential pieces of standard play for generations to come. Slowbro, Tangrowth, and Amoonguss were all bona fide OU in Gen 6, which also meant Regenerator pairings were going stronger than ever. They continued to thrive in Gen 7 OU as well, with Tangrowth remaining fully fledged OU once again, and the other two continuing to have important niches. Even the arrival of Toxapex couldn't fully display Slowbro and its ground countering ability. When Gen 8 arrived, Tangrowth was no longer fully OU, but it was still a great Pokemon, and even saw use in Ubers. Talk about a buff. Of course, Gen 8 is where the Slow Twins really took off, but we won't repeat the teleport section, though it can't be overstated how the Slow Twins were among the best, most important, common, dominant Pokemon around. Even their cousin Galarian Slowking reaped the benefits of them having received Regenerator. It didn't teleport, but it was an incredible Pokemon in its own right, and continues to thrive even in Gen 9 OU, where it packs the teleport replacement Chilly Reception. Regenerator is an incredible ability on just about everything, as seen in how it took these meager defensive Pokemon and turned them into nigh unkillable walling machines. Amoonguss also has an amazing history of success in VGC, with 3 world champions under its belt, just like Incineroar. Upon seeing Groudon and Kyogre in Gen 3, we wondered, gee, wouldn't it be neat to have those abilities in OU? But then again, perhaps it's for the best. It's probably fitting that such insane abilities reside only in the Uber tier. OU might not be sufficiently well equipped to handle such power. We should simply live with our sand stream and occasional snow warning come Gen 4. But mostly sand. That's the OU weather. Sun and rain though, that'd be crazy. Anyway, so Game Freak started blasting, and before you knew it, OU was being terrorized by monsters you'd previously sometimes see alongside Kyogre. Turns out, it didn't much matter that the setter was otherwise a largely nondescript water. The effect was so powerful, it took not just bans, but unprecedented changing of the rules from keeping perma rain from blitzing through everything in sight. You could have put Drizzle on Bibarel, and it would have facilitated some of the most unbelievably busted Pokemon to ever grace standard play. A lot of players were happier to face Deoxys attack than they were a Specs Kingdra in permanent unchecked rain. Ninetales was given a lot of grief for packing worse defensive typing, most notable being Stealth Rock Weak, which threatened its longevity and thus its ability to win the weather war that defined the meta. Additionally, the Sunny speed boosters, grass-type chlorophyll Pokemon, didn't have their stab boosted in the sun the way waters did in rain. Getting to use Solar Beam as grass stab might technically count, but you never want to use Solar Beam for how it allowed Tyranitar, Hippowdon, and Politoed to switch in and ruin you. At first, Sun was just seen as that weather you used to fully enable Blaziken, which eventually got banned, and was absurd on Sun, but generally busted in its own right. To use the parlance of the times, Sun was considered the hipster weather, the one used by those too cool for mainstream sand or rain. However, in spite of Tails being easier to exploit than the fairly sturdy Toad, this didn't stop it from actually being deceptively effective in its own right, and this was all it needed, because as it turns out, its armada of sun monsters, from Chlorograsses to Volcarona to Heatran sets ranging from Magma Storm to Flame Charge to even Cresselia, were so incredibly overwhelming that Sun went through its own series of nerfs, from Chlorophyll to Dugtrio to Arena Trap as a whole, because of how powerful Ninetales' merry band of renegades were when you couldn't throw Tyranitar and Heatran at the problem. Game Freak evidently realized they had unleashed too powerful a force, because in Gen 6, weather abilities were nerfed to effectively be ability versions of Sunny Day, Rain Dance, and so on. Or maybe they just wanted to give Mega Charizard Y Drought without feeling guilty about it. Nah, there's no way. Anyway, Ninetales' Sun and Politoed's Rain were all but non-existent in Gen 6 OU. There were a few attempts to make them work, especially Rain, thanks to how great Kingdra was, and some particularly inventive players found unique ways to make Sun work, especially since they had the option of double drought by pairing Ninetales with Mega Charizard Y. Ultimately though, they were too risky to be used consistently or in important games. However, Game Freak's nerf also gave them free license to, a generation later, provide these abilities to two other woebegone Pokemon down under luck, without completely breaking the game with the litany of new abusers that were also running around. Of course, Rain was actually viewed as controversial by some in Gen 7 OU, but ultimately, it was just incredibly consistent. Despite its Stealth Rock weakness, Pelipper was ultimately a major upgrade over Politoed thanks to the healing of Roost and especially the momentum grabbing of U-Turn. It could be quite awkward to get Rain abusers on the field safely in Gen 6, with Politoed feeling quite like dead weight as a result, but Pelipper was able to do so consistently, immediately, and with precision. Torkoal had a rougher go of it at first, but eventually, it wound being able to make use of its great physical bulk as well as superb support in Stealth Rock and Rapid Spin, and it wound up having such an impact in Gen 8 that it rose from Gen 7's PU all the way to UU, and with a serious OU niche to boot. And then it wound up being even more important in Gen 9 OU, with its Sun invaluable for activating all the photosynthesis running around, as well as the unique threat that was Walking Wake's Hydro Steam. Ultimately, whether its original permanent form or its modern limited form, you give Drizzle and Drought to pretty much anything, and you're going to unleash some major support. It was jokingly asked back in Gen 5 whether Drizzle would be broken if Magikarp was a setter, and honestly, with Swiftstone, Kingdra, and Kabutops waiting in the wings, yeah, probably. Since its inception, Volcarona's quadruple Stealth Rock weakness has been a fundamental aspect of its being. Here you have one of the most powerful monsters in the game taken to arguably broken heights. It's been suspected many a time and demanded to be suspected many more times by one of the most over-the-top powerful boosting moves in the game. However, in order to unleash this beast that can sweep an entire team at a moment's notice, you have to contend with half its health being ripped off by Stealth Rock. Volcarona is renowned for having very few safe checks and for playing around it being immensely difficult, but playing around it becomes infinitely easier if you have only to take out the remaining half of its health, thereby nullifying the strong natural bulk that plays such a major role and why it's such a pain to begin with. Volcarona can and does sweep even after taking half from rocks, and players have toyed with the likes of Citrus Berry to offset the effect. While tactics such as Roost and Giga Drain can help as well, before it had these moves in Black and White 2, it had a widely feared Chesto Rest set, while Sun teams let it enjoy Morning Sun. However, the Stealth Rock principle that's so crucial in handling multi-scale Dragon Dance Dragonite is amplified for the faster Volcarona and its special Dragon Dance that's also a Calm Mind. So of course, Gen 8's heavy-duty boots completely flipped the dynamic on its head. Yes, Volcarona lost hidden power, and that was irritating, but seeing as the trade-off was a nigh immortal set that started working things like Safeguard into its move pool to fully take advantage of its newfound bulk, barring the knockoff no good player would ever let it take, and never had to worry about being impeded by hazards, then yeah, it was absolutely worth it. Something this powerful being completely hazard immune was a reason why many players at the time didn't like boots. It just felt off that something this punishing and game ending could completely ignore all the work you'd done up until that point. Previously, even if your team was some degree of Volk weak, if you fought and scrapped tooth and nail to aggressively get and maintain Rock Sub, you'd give yourself a chance. Heck, even a Spike would help. Now though, you can take your max hazards and watch as Volcarona doesn't care about any of them en route to quiver dancing through your team. The effect was almost uncanny. Volcarona even took on newfound defensive use for how it thwarted many of Kyurem's most dangerous variants before its ban. The double whammy here was when Gen 9's Terastallization basically returning hidden power to its arsenal. In an extreme matter, Terra already breaks many Pokemon like Regieleki, yes, but as absurd as Terra Volcarona can be, it is difficult to imagine it being completely unmanageable, as it wound up being to merit its first ban to Ubers if it weren't for its ability to ignore hazards, especially in the Gen 9 landscape where it is famously easy to stack hazards and equally difficult to get rid of them. Forget having to contend with just rocks, you'd be starting at below 50% in most games thanks to rocks and at least one layer of spikes. Gen 8 Volcarona was a whole new beast and allowed for Gen 9 to fly as ferociously as it did. In Gen 2, famously the stall generation, a major reason why stall teams were so unbreakable was Skarmory. Anyone familiar with competitive history won't be surprised to learn that Skarm did Skarm things right from the beginning, with that tremendous defense and typing. However, Skarm is also famous for using that peerless defensive profile to stack multiple layers of spikes. In Gen 2, it didn't do this, not because there was only one layer of spikes back then, but because it didn't learn the move at all. It was more akin to Corviknight than the Skarm we all know and love and or hate. That Skarm would arrive a generation later. Skarmory gained its spikes in Gen 3, and the game was never the same. Gen after gen, for all the power creep flying around every corner, one of the few consistencies and anchors of defensive stability was Skarmory throwing down its spikes in the face of pretty much everything. So overwhelming was its spiking power and longevity that at various periods from Gens 4 to 6, unable to withstand spikes pressure through hazard removal, teams opted instead to run as many spike immune Pokemon as possible. This was inspired by the team style that had originated in Gen 3, referred to as Superman for how it had as many Pokemon as possible to fly over the spikes. Skarmory, of course, was one of them, both being immune to the spikes and providing them. Even the presence of a dedicated counter Pokemon in Magneton couldn't quell Skarmory's power that was so overt as to be considered broken by many, with several top players begging for some sort of spikes ban or nerf, limiting it to 1 or 2 layers because Skarmory simply walled too much and the rapid spinners were all exploitable in one way or another. And even if you ran Magneton, you weren't necessarily safe against the spikes it would leave behind, to say nothing of the fact that Magneton had to watch for Skarmory's common partner Dugtrio, or even its own Magneton. That's right, Magneton was also an amazing partner to Skarmory. After all, alongside Magneton, you want a bunch of Pokemon that exploit the absence of opposing Skarmory. What does that really well? Why, your own Skarmory, of course. Now bear in mind, in Gen 3, Skarmory didn't even have Roost. In Gen 4 and later, it became even more obnoxious to KO, despite power creep that included a buff to Magneton in the form of Magnezone. It didn't even necessarily need leftovers, as it could run Shed Shell to escape Magnezone, or even in Gen 5 and later, Rocky Helmet to mess with rapid spinners like Excadrill even more, while providing even more offense while on defense against various U-turns and outrages. This was all contingent on it being the spiking machine that it was. The game is so different to the point of being almost unrecognizable if Skarmory never gets this move. Spikes are great, sure, but they're best when they come from a good Pokemon, and Skarmory was, for so long, the spiker, fully using its innate talents demonstrated in Gen 2 to one of the most impactful ends the game had to offer. Clefable was a largely unremarkable Pokemon in the first 3 generations. It had some cool toys to play with, to be sure. It could potentially pull off a belly drum sweep in Gen 2, but ultimately, it was let down by its stats, not quite gelling with everything else. Mono normal typing just isn't that great without insane bulk or something really special. Then Generation 4 gave it that something special in the form of one of the most ridiculously broken abilities ever, Magic Guard. Being able to completely ignore any and all indirect damage is huge. Forget worrying about Toxic, Leech Seed, Sandstorm, or entry hazards. Clefable takes a whopping 0% from all of it combined. Gen 4 specifically also made it immune to full paralysis. And while its stats aren't amazing, they actually wind up becoming more than the sum of their parts by virtue of the fact that it's never ever getting worn down passively. So it effectively gets to use all of its bulk, just as not having to cut into it by even just Stealth Rock. Another way to look at it is that it feels like it's bulkier in practice than you would think just by looking at its stats. Something like its fellow UU Pokemon Milotic is amazingly bulky, of course, but it has to be careful around pressure from hazards when taking on threats like Moltres. This also means it has to spend more turns healing with Recover. Meanwhile, Clefable can be more proactive more often, so it puts more pressure on the opponent. As such, Clefable was quite a star in UU. Its defensive sets were incredibly resilient, but a surprise was just how potent it could be with offensive sets, because Magic Guard also meant it took no recoil damage from Life Orb, making it the most effective user of it in the game by far. It wasn't just limited to more offensive versions of its trusty bulky Calm Mindset either. Mixed Fable, as it was called, wielded Stab Double Edge to great effect, also ignoring the move's recoil, effectively using boosted, invested Fire Blast and Grass Knot to trip up resist. Clefable really took off when it went from a sleeper pick to a metagame shifting megastar in OU, as it wound up just about completely eclipsing Blissey and shaping the metagame in its hazard immune image, rendering many a team unviable for how completely untouched it was by the passive damage they so relied on. Even its bulk, not seemingly particularly impressive at first, was more than sufficient to take on major threats like Heatran, Zapdos, Flygon and Starmie, since it was almost always effortlessly at full health. Its presence almost single-handedly knocked Shaman out of the metagame too, and its calm mindset wound up being the straw that broke the camel's back regarding Dugtrio getting Arena Trap banned from the tier. Clefable actually wound up being so powerful in its own right that there were many reputable players that wanted it banned from OU as well, and even better, Magic Guard gave it a niche in Ubers of all tiers. Oh, and it continues. In more recent times, Clefable has even infiltrated Gen 5 OU, becoming a legitimate force there despite the major power creep. Of course, then XY came around, turned Clefable into a fairy type, and turned it into the household name it has been ever since. The slight boost to its base special attack also helped, to be sure. However, the blessing of actual resist and even viable stab was just incredible. Previously, Clefable's only immunity had been to Shadow Ball. Nice to be sure, but by and large, it did its work while neutral to the attacks it shrugged off. This may seem like an unusual pick, but we find it fascinating and uniquely fitting for this list because nothing about Bisharp itself changed from Gen 5 to Gen 6. Technically, you could have the same exact Bisharp that's such a threat in Gen 6 and Gen 5 already. It didn't get any new moves or abilities, it didn't take advantage of any new items, it didn't have any of its stats buffed. However, everything around Bisharp changed. As a result, it went from an okay UU Pokemon in Gen 5 to one of the most ferocious, defining terrors of standard play in Gen 6. It took advantage of seemingly everything new about Gen 6. Let's start with its primary stab, Knockoff. Knockoff certainly had use in Gens 3 to 5, but it was solely for the utility of removing items, which to be clear was very good, but it wasn't a weapon for direct offensive damage as it became with its monstrous buff in Gen 6. As a dark type, having the move as stab was a formidable weapon, and indeed Bisharp wielded the strongest knockoff in the game until Yveltal received the move in Oraz, and still Bisharp had the strongest outside of Ubers once Hoopa Unbound was banned. Technically, Mega Absols was stronger, but it was beholden to its Megastone, whereas Bisharp could actually run Life Orb, thus making it stronger. Plus, Bisharp was a much better Pokemon than Mega Absol anyway. Now, Knockoff wasn't just amazing because of its new power, it was also newly spammable because Dark, already a fairly threatening type on its own right, was no longer resisted by Steel, one of the most ubiquitous types in the game. Now, Heatran and Ferrothorn wouldn't be able to shrug the move off. They'd get wrecked like most other neutral Pokemon, unable to stand up to Bisharp's power. Suddenly, Bisharp didn't need to run anti-Steel coverage, like it awkwardly tried in Gen 5 with Low Kick. Knockoff was the anti-Steel move, like it was almost everything else that didn't resist it. This meant it didn't have to make any concessions for its move pool. It could just run Dark Stab. Dark no longer being resisted by Steel was also absolutely enormous for Bisharp's incredibly strong Sucker Punch, tied with Honchkrow for strongest in the game outside of Ubers, taking into account the Mega Absol Megastone factor. As such, Bisharp could Swords Dance up and easily cleave through faster Steels that otherwise thwarted. Having a faster Dark resist wasn't the easiest thing to find either, but it became almost a necessity to not get thrashed by late game Bisharp. It was one of the reasons Keldeo was so popular. Okay, but Dark Stab wasn't everything. Yes, Dark could now hit Steel, but it also gained the weakness to Fairy. But there, once again, was Gen 6 arranging itself into perfect shape to be destroyed by Bisharp. Previously, Steel Stab had been incredibly limited. Scizor's Bullet Punch was used for its priority, Jirachi's Iron Head for its flinching, and Metagross's Meteor Mash for its power. The fact that they hit Tyranitar super effectively was amazing, but they didn't have much super effective reach outside of that. Suddenly, Steel was a newly valuable attacking type to take on those pesky fairies, who resisted so many popular attacking types of the previous generation, and which packed few elusive weaknesses, and unlike the other types super effective against Fairy, Poison, this secondary stab also smacked around that other known dark resist, Tyranitar. As such, Bisharp was a dark type with a secondary stab that shattered Fairy types, leaving it free to spam its dark stab in peace. As a bonus, occasional Pursuit Bisharp sets also had their pursuing range expanded. What was really amazing though was that Gen 6 finally brought about a new method of dealing with hazards besides Rapid Spin. Defog was buffed to remove the hazards on both sides of the field. Defog also had the side effect of lowering evasion. Bisharp's Defiant ability gave it a Swords Dance boost if it had a stat lowered. This notably meant that Landorus Therian's Intimidate, rather than drop its attack by 1, wound up raising it by 1. However, that wasn't new. This buff Defog was. Suddenly, everyone was overjoyed that they could remove hazards more easily, but if Bisharp switched in on that Defog, it would gain +2 attack without having to spend a turn on Swords Dancing. It remains to this day one of the most vicious punishes to hazard removal there is, if not the most vicious, depending on how you feel about contrary Superior gaining an evasion boost. However, Superior doesn't switch into popular Gen 6 Defoggers, the Laddie Twins, like Bisharp does. Bisharp's hazard protection was so essential, it became the staple of its own dominant, partially eponymous team archetype in early XY. Dio Sharp, where Dio speed or defense would lay the hazards, and Bisharp would either abuse use them or punish their removal. Even after the bans of the Deoxys forms, Bisharp continued to punish Defog in the generation so perfectly calibrated for it that we felt it was just too fitting to give it the #1 spot on this list. And that's it. Obviously, with so many buffs across the long history of competitive Pokemon, there were a lot vying for this list. We'll almost certainly have to address them in a follow-up. So let us know which ones you think are most deserving, as well as your general thoughts on the ones included in this video. Subjective as they are, we think, at the very least, they represent a good deal of important changes made to the game throughout the years. And also, if you want to see a similar video, be sure to check out our video on the buffs that didn't help Pokemon, which we released last year. Thanks for watching, everyone. And as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos. And thank you to everyone else watching as well. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Megamon VGC, Nurse Jake, Jack G, Pretzel SP, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soares and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu for their major support of our videos. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.